Recently, I had a dream, and it was so scary that even though it was the middle of the night, I refused to go back to sleep in case that dream would return. It made me sympathetic with Daniel because he was a man who had dreams and night visions, and they were really scary because God allowed him to see the future. Daniel and his three friends were some of those best and brightest of Jerusalem that the Babylonians captured and took into captivity in Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar liked these intelligent young men. He took them, Daniel was probably about 15 years old, and he would take them into the palace and train them in the ways of Babylon. He would even give them new names. Daniel's name was changed to Belteshazzar, and his three friends became Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This book is the only book written in two languages. It's written in Hebrew and Aramaic because it not only tells us the history of the Jews, Israel, but the history of Gentiles. And Aramaic was the Gentile language of the day. In the first chapter, or actually the first 6 chapters, we find the history of Daniel. The last 6 chapters are the prophecies of Daniel. And it starts right out with Daniel and his three friends refusing to eat the food in Babylon because they would break God's dietary laws. The food was probably unclean food. It was probably prepared the wrong way. And they said, "Would you feed us vegetables and water?" The man in authority over them said, "I'm responsible for you. If you get sick, they'll cut off my head." They said, "Test us for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, these 4 young men were healthier and plumper than before. The result of their obedience was not only health, but God gave them great wisdom and understanding. We're told that they could understand dreams and visions. So the lesson is, when we trust the sovereignty of God, God gives us His power. And we could really see that power in chapter 2, because Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He has a dream that frightens him. He calls in all the magicians and sorcerers in his kingdom, and they can't interpret it. He says to his sorcerers, "Either you interpret this dream or you die." They said, "Fine, tell us the dream, we'll tell you the meaning." He said, "No, tell me the dream and the meaning." They said, "No man can do that, only gods." They came to take Daniel away to kill him. And he said, "Tell the king there is a God in heaven that can interpret dreams." And then he and his three friends had a prayer meeting. And I'm sure it went something like this: "God, you know all things. You're sovereign." That's what this book is about. God is sovereign over history. They said, "God, you know all things. Reveal it to us." And he did. Daniel went into Nebuchadnezzar and he said, "Your dream was this. You saw a statue with a gold head, silver chest, bronze thighs, iron legs, iron and clay feet. The interpretation is there are going to be 4 future Gentile kingdoms. You, Nebuchadnezzar, are that gold head. That's Babylon. The silver are the Persians. The bronze are the Greeks. And the 4th kingdom is not named. And then you saw in your dream a stone cut without hands that crushed that 4th kingdom." Well, Nebuchadnezzar was quite impressed with Daniel's interpretation, and he was so impressed he promoted him to be head over all the other wise men. But he also became very prideful, and he thought of himself as that gold head, and he made a gold image apparently of himself, and he made a decree that at the sound of the music, everybody had to fall down and worship that image. Well, now, of course, those 3 young men not only knew God's dietary laws, he knew that God said, "You shall have no other gods before you." They couldn't bow down. Look with me at chapter 3, verse 15. Nebuchadnezzar says to them, "If you don't worship this idol, you will be thrown in the fiery furnace. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? In verse 17 they say, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us out of your hand. But even if he doesn't, let it be known, O king, that we won't serve your gods or worship your golden image. I love that, because they say, look, we know God can save us. We believe he will. But number 3, even if he doesn't, we're still going to trust him. The result of their obedience to God is that they're thrown into the fiery furnace. But in chapter 3, verse 24, King Nebuchadnezzar looks into that furnace. Now, keep in mind, it was heated up 7 times hotter than normal, so that even the soldiers who were throwing the young man in were killed, burned to death. Verse 24, the king looks in and he says to his officials, was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire? And they said, certainly, O king. And he said, look, I see 4 men loosed, walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like the son of the gods. Don't you love this? They're in a fiery furnace. Have you ever had a fiery trial? Have you ever been there? And you feel bound. They were. But suddenly they're still in the trial, they're still in the furnace, but they're loose. And they're not alone. Jesus is with them. The lesson is trusting the sovereign God brings God's presence. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has a second dream. He says, I had this dream. There was a tree, a grand tree, fruitful, beautiful. The animals lived under it, and an angel came and chopped it down, leaving a stump. And then someone in this dream goes crazy and lives like an animal, and this dream disturbed him. He again calls in the magicians and the sorcerers, and once more they cannot interpret the dream. Daniel is called, and he said, "Oh, king, I wish that this were about your enemies and not about you. But you are that tree. You've been grand and glorious, but because of your pride, you are going to be cut down by insanity for 7 years until you repent of your pride. Then your kingdom will be restored." Look at chapter 4, verse 29. Even with that warning, it tells us that 12 months later, Nebuchadnezzar was walking on the roof of the royal palace in Babylon. The king reflected and said, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty?" Do you hear anything repeated in there? And those words were no more than out of his mouth before God said, "Sovereignty has been removed from you." And for 7 years, just like he'd been warned, he went insane. He lived like an animal. He ate the grass. His hair grew long. His fingernails grew like claws. At the end of that period, in verse 34, he says he came to his senses. He blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is everlasting. In verse 35, he says, he does according to his will. No one can say to him, "What have you done?" Don't you love that? Here's Nebuchadnezzar the king who discovers he's not sovereign, God is. That's the end of Nebuchadnezzar. He dies, and his grandson Belshazzar becomes the king. In chapter 5, Daniel interprets God's message at Belshazzar's feast. Now the situation is Babylon is being conquered by the Persians. They have taken a great deal of the territory, but Babylon, the city, is still safe. And that's where the king is. And he feels very confident. Because after all, the method of warfare at that time was to siege a city, surround it, and starve them out. Well, Babylon had a wall 87 feet wide, 387 feet high. There was a river of fresh water running through this city. They had stored up enough food for 20 years. We are invincible. He's having a party. He invites in 1,000 of his dearest friends and goes and gets the sacred goblets that they took out of the temple in Jerusalem when they conquered Jerusalem, and allows his friends to drink their wine out of it. Suddenly, the party is interrupted by a hand writing on the wall. Very frightening. Everybody wants to know what it is. Once more, the magicians and sorcerers can't tell him. Daniel is called in, and he says the meaning is, your kingdom has been numbered, weighed, and divided. It is going to end. That very night, Belshazzar died. And history tells us that it was no problem for the Persians to take over the city of Babylon. They simply stopped up the water of the river running through it, crawled under the gate, found everybody drunk, and conquered the city without a fight. God said it, it happened, didn't it? In chapter 6, we now have Darius. The Medes and the Persians are now in control of Babylon. Darius, who is a Mede, is king, and there's a plot in the palace against Daniel. Because after all, this guy is hard to take. He's handsome, he's intelligent, and he has all this wisdom. He knows things that nobody else does. The only thing he does wrong in their eyes is worship his God. So they talk Darius into making a decree that for 30 days, no one can petition any god except him. Of course, Daniel won't do that. He prays to his own God, and the result of his obedience to God is he's thrown in the lion's den. Now, Darius apparently really liked Daniel because he couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, he went to the door of that lion's den in chapter 6, verse 20. He says, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? And Daniel says, O king, my God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me. Now, when those 3 young men in the fiery furnace were called out, taken out, we're told that their hair was not singed, their clothes were not burned, and they didn't even smell of smoke. Here is Daniel, who has not been harmed in the lion's den. The lesson is trusting the sovereign God brings God's protection. In the next 6 chapters, we go from the history of Daniel to prophecies of Daniel, where God gives him 4 visions of what the future is going to hold. In chapter 7, God gives Daniel a view of all human history. He says, and the vision is of 4 great beasts.